The end of 2023 saw a bunch of major releases in PC gaming software. We're seeing games that are fully ray traced at every graphic setting, including in AMD-sponsored titles like Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which is arguably the best-looking game ever made, although it's got some strong competition from games like Alan Wake 2, where even without its path tracing mode, it looks stunning, but it also does offer a path tracing mode. But is the 4070 strong enough to take advantage of that? Well, are you going to be using DLSS? Are you going to be using frame generation? We'll be taking a look at all of that. And Cyberpunk with its Phantom Liberty update also moving to its path tracing mode, being no longer a tech preview. But again, is the 4070 strong enough for that to weigh into your decision making between these two GPUs? Well, some other games aren't going to be quite pushing those same levels of graphical boundaries and performance, but we'll still take a look at those, as well as Unreal Engine 5 games, where this is the future of a huge amount of game development, especially as we move into 2024 and beyond, with tons of developers moving to Unreal Engine 5. But with features like Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, this can be extremely demanding. How do these GPUs stack up? Let's find out. And if you're thinking about upgrading your hardware in 2024, take a look at today's sponsor, Jawa.gg. This is where gamers buy, build, and sell. Also, I can get you $10 off your first purchase, and Jawa already has some of the best deals out there on used and new gear, and you can take a look at some great pre-built gaming PCs, along with individual parts like graphics cards. And if you're looking to fund your upgrade, you can sell your GPU. You can list it yourself with your own price and your own picture and all that, but they can also totally take the hassle out of that by clicking the Get an Offer button, where they offer you cash for your GPU. They deal with the shipping label. You just send it off, usually get paid within 1 business day. Very quick and convenient if you just want to get some money to help fund that upgrade instantly. They also have a community of over 10,000 members on Discord, where you can talk about your upcoming PC build and sales. And overall, again, take advantage of that $10 off your first purchase by following the link in the video description and or pinned comment. Anyway, let's hop into the benchmarks, and I'll give you some final thoughts on which GPU I would recommend at the end of the video. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is arguably the best looking game ever made, although this particular scene doesn't quite show off the jungles as nicely. It is the most demanding part of the benchmark. And interestingly, despite being AMD sponsored, it is a ray tracing only title, which probably explains the 4070's 10% lead here in the averages and 12% in the 1% lows. And I'm taking it as this first most demanding combat section of the built-in benchmark. That was 1080p. What if we move up to 1440p Ultra, where the 4070's lead drops to 6% in the averages and 5% in the 1% lows? However, the overall frame rates now are lower at 53 and 50 on the averages and the 1% lows in the mid-40s, which means that these might not be the settings that either GPU would actually be wanting to play the game at, especially in a first-person shooter-style game. So one way to boost frame rates would be to upscale. Here we're looking at DLSS versus FSR at the quality setting. And I do think image quality edge goes to DLSS here, despite this being one of the better FSR implementations that I've seen. And this boosts frame rates to 79 and 71 respectively, giving the 4070 an 11% lead in the averages and a 14% lead in the 1% lows. Again, still, being a ray tracing only title, that is kind of expected. Now, this is one of the games featuring FSR 3 frame generation. There's no DLSS 3 frame generation, but both GPUs could use quality FSR 3 upscaling with frame generation. Interestingly, though, I'm not going to talk about the performance numbers, because the AMD GPU does VSync lock, even if you turn VSync off in-game, but the Nvidia GPU doesn't. So somehow that's being handled differently by the game, so I can't give raw performance numbers other than they can both pretty much lock to 120 if you wanted them to. Anyway, another way to boost performance would be to turn down to high settings rather than upscaling. Now both GPUs are much more comfortable at 72 and 66 respectively. Again, all the settings in this game do include ray tracing, so it's still ray traced, and the 4070 takes a 9% lead and 13% in the 1% lows. But I think we're starting to hit more of the frame rate numbers where a lot of people would be happy, although in a first-person shooter, you might still want to boost performance further, and we can do that by upscaling. Again, here we're looking at DLSS and FSR at the quality setting without any frame generation. The 4070 can hit 106 FPS here, with the 7800 XT hitting 88, giving the 4070 actually a 20% lead at these settings. So it is a pretty dramatic lead, and DLSS is giving better image quality than FSR is here, especially if you look at the fine details and like the fencing in the background and things like that. But what if you wanted to use these GPUs at 4K resolution? Well, ultra settings, you're down below 30 FPS. At high settings, without any upscaling, it is 37 and 39 respectively. Interestingly, the 7800 XT takes a 5% lead here, despite this being ray tracing. But if you look at the VRAM, we might be spilling past 12 gigabytes of VRAM here. If you're looking at the allocation totals, which could explain AMD taking a small lead despite ray tracing enabled. Because interestingly, when we turn on upscaling at the quality setting, again, DLSS versus FSR, the lead goes back to the 4070, much more like what we were seeing before. The 4070 hits 63 FPS versus 56 on the 7800 XT. It's definitely playable on both of them, and this is the most demanding section of the benchmark, so many areas of the game will perform better. It's a 13% lead for the 4070, though, and 15% lead in the 1% lows, and again, better image quality. Now, Alan Wake 2 is, again, arguably one of the best looking games ever made, and we'll start out looking at the 1080p high settings. Interestingly, this game does not offer a non-FSR DLSS pathway. You can just disable upscaling and run at the native resolution. And here we see the 7800 XT takes an 11% lead at 82 FPS versus 74 at 1080p high, although I do think the DLAA pathway looks noticeably less sparkly in the little details. So I do think the Nvidia GPU has a better image quality here, despite both running at native resolution. And the 7800 XT taking a lead at 1440p high settings, again, native resolution, we see an 8% lead for the 7800 XT at 56 versus 52. In a slow-paced game like this, I think those frame rates are perfectly acceptable. Again, a small image quality lead for the 4070. But you could definitely enable upscaling here. We're looking at DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, and my relative performance numbers are based on no frame generation enabled, but this game does feature DLSS 3 frame generation, not FSR 3 frame generation. Takes a bit of a latency penalty, though. I don't absolutely love it here, and both GPUs perform just fine for this game without any frame generation at these settings, 79 versus 86, 9% lead for the 7800 XT, although the 1% lows are a lot tighter. What if we moved up to 4K resolution at the high setting? By the way, high is the highest non-ray traced setting in the game. So this is just the high preset. There is no ultra preset. And we're looking at DLSS FSR quality to get us to some playable frame rates averaging around 50. Interestingly, the frame time graph looks really spiky for the AMD GPU. I'm not sure if it's just AMD in general or if it's the FSR pathway that's causing the issues, but the 1% lows look pretty bad there. But this game is one of the two fully path traced major releases in addition to Cyberpunk. So what if we looked at the path tracing mode maxed out at 1080p resolution, RT high, which is the full path tracing settings, no upscaling, neither GPU does well. So yes, the 4070 is doubling the performance of the 7800 XT, but it's winning in a murder-suicide. It is 34 FPS average, and the 1% lows are at 24. So I don't think either GPU would be used at those settings. At 1080p RT high, but with DLSS/FSR quality upscaling enabled, I don't like upscaling at 1080p. That being said, the DLSS plus ray reconstruction possibly looks acceptable here. And I'm also showing the frame generation in the middle, although it's not factored into my frame rate numbers. We're still only hitting a 53 average on the 4070, and you're upscaling at 1080p. So that's pretty brutal here. What if we moved up to 1440p? I'm not even going to try native resolution. If we look at quality level upscaling, we can see the 4070 hits 38. In a slow-paced game like this, maybe somebody would possibly play the game like this. It is, like I said, pretty slow-paced. The 7800 XT is at 21 FPS. That does give an 81% lead for the 4070, and the 1% lows are even more of a bloodbath. Look at the frame time graph on that 7800 XT. Now, if you want a higher frame rate, you can go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, but while DLSS is a very good upscaler, you're losing a lot of details and stability in the little tree branches and things like that. So despite this being a big win and getting maybe playable frame rate numbers, I really don't think that this is the way I would recommend playing the game. So I really feel like the path tracing modes here are a bit too demanding even for the 4070. But there's one other path tracing game we could take a look at, so let's go ahead and do that. So Cyberpunk 2077 RT Overdrive mode has left tech preview status, is now just one of the graphic settings. Fully path traced, but even at 1080p resolution without upscaling, the 4070 is only good for 34 frames per second. So I just really don't think that that's the way most people are going to play the game, although it does give the 4070 a 70% advantage over the 7800 XT. Staying at 1080p resolution and upscaling at the quality setting, I do think the ray reconstruction adds a lot to the upscaling, even at 1080p, which does make this possibly a way someone might want to play the game, and it does get the 4070 all the way up to 67 FPS, which then would be a good baseline for frame generation from there. The 7800 XT hits 37 FPS, and again, without without frame generation, it's an 81% lead for the 4070. If we move up to 1440p resolution, where I think these GPUs are most likely to be purchased, now we see even with quality level upscaling, the 4070 is only hitting 44 FPS. So yeah, that's a 91% lead, but it's probably not the way you'd want to play the game. And I also don't think it's a good baseline for frame generation, although perhaps some people would disagree. I'd prefer to be closer to 60 FPS before kicking on frame generation, which you could get to if you enable performance mode upscaling. But unfortunately, I think, again, like if you look at the palm tree branches and things like that, they're just super shimmery, little details. Like I just think this is too aggressive upscaling for a 1440p screen and not the way I'd choose to play the game personally. However, like I said, you do hit playable frame rate numbers now, but I think you're taking a big trade-off to image quality to get there. Just a reminder that you could play Cyberpunk without ray tracing. You could just play at the ultra settings, in which case the 4070 is good for 74, the 7800 XT is good for 94 FPS on the built-in benchmark, giving the 7800 XT actually a sizable 27% lead at the non-ray trace settings in this game. So, and honestly, the game still does look quite great, although the path tracing mode is very impressive. But let's go ahead and move on to some less demanding tests. What if you're more of a competitive gamer? Maybe you play Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. I'm at the basic settings here because I think that's more how people play competitive games rather than pushing graphics settings. So at 1080p basic, we're seeing a 6% lead for the 7800 XT at 301 FPS versus 284 on the 4070. And they're both at about the same 200 FPS in the 1% lows. I think if these frame rate numbers aren't getting you the kill, it's probably a skill issue. But anyway, if you move up to 1440p basic, we're now at 233 FPS for the 7800 XT and 207 on the 4070, giving the 7800 XT a 13% advantage in the averages. But the 1% lows are a more sizable 26% advantage for the 7800 XT at 152 versus 121, and that could potentially be more noticeable, especially if you don't want to miss that kill with a little bit of a stutter in those 1% lows. Now, if we move up to 4K resolution at 4K basic, both GPUs are still good for well over 100 frames per second, even at 4K resolution. Again, we're at a low preset for the graphical quality, though, and this is 121 FPS versus 138, so a 14% lead for the 7800 XT. And again, you could easily enable upscaling on top of those settings. But let's move on to one of the most popular PC games of the year, and that is Baldur's Gate 3. At 1080p ultra settings, you're actually most likely to be CPU limited in large city areas like the Act 3 Baldur's Gate City. And here we're seeing the GPUs basically tied in the averages and a small difference in the 1% lows. The 1% lows can be affected by little stutters with the CPU usage pretty easily here as well, which is I actually think what we're seeing here. But anyway, at 1440p resolution, we're more GPU bound, and we are seeing a 14% advantage for the 7800 XT at 116 versus 102. The 1% lows do give a larger advantage of the 7800 XT, but again, we can just get kind of CPU-related stutters in here as there's earthquakes in the city and things like that, so I wouldn't read too much into that, especially since we see the 1% lows swing the other way here at 4K Ultra. But again, now we're mostly GPU limited, at least in the averages, and we are seeing a 66 versus a 59 in the averages, giving a 12% lead for the 7800 XT. Again, basically, in this style of game, it's looking like even going up to 4K resolution, both GPUs do absolutely fine for the types of frame rates that you would need. What about Starfield? Well, at 1080p Ultra, although the Ultra setting would enable upscaling, I've disabled that, so 1080p Ultra settings native resolution. We're good for 85 FPS on the 7800 XT and 74 on the 4070, which is a 15% lead for the 7800 XT. This is in one of the more demanding city areas. There are slightly more demanding areas in the game, but much of the game is actually much less demanding than the big cities. But anyway, moving up to 1440p resolution, still at the Ultra settings and no upscaling. The 7800 XT hits 69, nice, and the 4070 hits 61, which is a 13% advantage for the 7800 XT, although a 24% advantage in the 1% lows, which could be a bit more noticeable. Now, both GPUs doing very well here, but again, with a first-person shooter, a lot of times people would push for a bit higher frame rate. If you do that through upscaling at the quality settings, so 67% resolution scale per axis, we're now getting 84 FPS on the 7800 XT and 76 on the 4070, which is still an 11% lead for the 7800 XT. The 1% lows are about tied at 60-ish now, though. But I will say image quality advantage for DLSS is noticeable in some areas, especially fine details, and the game does feature DLSS 3 frame generation, but still has not yet added FSR 3 frame generation as of the time of my testing. At 4K Ultra settings, you would want to kick on DLSS or FSR at the quality upscaling setting, and that does get the 7800 XT to about a 60 FPS average, and the 4070 about 54. It's very playable. It's an 11% advantage for the 7800 XT, and you could easily turn settings down a bit more from here if you wanted to chase a bit higher frame rates at 4K. Now, let's take a look at Resident Evil 4 Remake for a look at Capcom's RE engine performance, and it's a very performant engine in max settings, which do include some ray tracing, albeit it's really low-res reflections that I actually don't really like the look of, but whatever. Anyway, even maxed out at 1080p, they are tied at around 130 FPS, technically 129 versus 126. Even the 1% lows are over 110 FPS, so 2 or 3 FPS percentage lead for the 4070, but both performing extremely well. Moving up to 1440p resolution, keeping max settings, which include ray tracing, we are seeing the 7800 XT take a small lead, but again, it's basically a tie. They're both giving us about 100 frames per second, and even the 1% lows are up there pretty high as well. And again, this is a good showing, although again, while this does include ray tracing, it's not a heavy workload, and we might be seeing some VRAM limitations on the 12 gigabytes, considering the 7800 XT just took the lead. And as we move up to 4K resolution, the 7800 XT takes a wider lead by 14% in the averages and 18% in the 1% lows. They're both doing well here. It's 64 versus 56 FPS in the averages and 59 versus 50 in the 1% lows. But if you look at the VRAM allocation on the AMD GPU, it is pretty high. Now, Nvidia doesn't always need the same amount of VRAM due to differences in compression and things like that, but explaining the lead with ray tracing enabled does make sense that we're probably surpassing the 12 gigabytes. Let's move on to some Unreal Engine 5 testing. Lords of the Fallen is the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 game that I've tested yet. At 1080p Ultra, these GPUs are good for over 60 FPS, but just barely. And it is a 5% lead in the averages for the 4070 at 65 versus 62, although the 7800 XT leads by 6% in the 1% lows. Although the 1% lows are more like traversal stutter related, so I wouldn't read too much into that. At 1440p Ultra, again, these GPUs are basically tied. However, unfortunately, that's 46 FPS versus 45 FPS. They are actually not doing great here. And again, this is just an extremely demanding game. Lots of detail and things like that. Now, you can obviously turn things down a bit. One choice is going down to high settings, another choice is upscaling, or both. So obviously, you don't need to crank everything to Ultra, and it does respond extremely well to upscaling from a performance perspective. That's what we're looking at here. If you kick on quality level upscaling, our performance numbers jump all the way to 73 and 68 respectively, giving a 7% lead to the 4070 in the averages, although a 10% lead to the 7800 XT in the 1% lows. So again, maybe call this basically a tie performance-wise. However, the image quality edge I would give to DLSS. So in games where we see this in Unreal Engine 5 a lot, the 1%, sorry, the 1% lows, but the performance responds extremely well to upscaling, better than it does to turning down graphic settings. Like here, we're dropping down to high settings. We are now over 60 FPS now. They're actually tied at 64 FPS in the averages, 3 FPS lead for the 7800 XT and the 1% lows. But basically, what I'm getting at here is we got a bigger boost by turning on DLSS and FSR than we did by going to the high settings. So Unreal Engine 5 seems to respond extremely well to upscaling from a performance standpoint. If we go up to 4K resolution at the high settings, I'm not even going to try showing Ultra here, we're both at 35 FPS and 30 in the 1% lows. So if you really want a 30 FPS capped, maxed out 4K experience, you could get it, but it's really not even maxed out because we're at high settings instead of Ultra settings. So yeah, extremely demanding as we increase resolution. But what if we upscale? So here I'm actually going up to the Ultra settings, but using performance mode upscaling, which is an internal resolution of 1080p that's then upscaled to 4K. DLSS does a much better job of this if you look at the fine details in the grass and like things that are disoccluded by like the character's shield and things like that as it swings. But anyway, both GPUs are close to a 60 FPS experience now. So again, just showing that the Unreal Engine 5 games do tend to be kind of, seems like it's designed a bit around upscaling. Anyway, if we hop into a different one, this is Immortals of Aveum. At 1080p Ultra, both GPUs are performing well at 85 and 99 respectively, which actually gives a 17% lead to the 7800 XT in the averages and an even larger 30% lead in the 1% lows at 83 versus 64. Now, why are we seeing such a difference here? Well, different games will perform differently on different hardware, but keep in mind that this game is one of the first games that had FSR 3 integration, so it's possible that AMD has worked closely with the game developers for, optimizing performance here as one possible explanation for the kind of outsized lead we're seeing on the 7800 XT here. What if we move up to 1440p resolution, where I think people are more likely to actually be targeting these GPUs? Well, now we're seeing 58 FPS on the 4070, but 70 on the 7800 XT, giving it a 21% lead in the averages, and an even larger 32% lead in the 1% lows at 44 versus 58. So again, this is one of the largest leads for the 7800 XT that we have seen. But again, I think that this game probably is particularly well optimized for AMD hardware, would be my guess. Again, especially if you compare it to other games that we have tested here. Both GPUs were playable at those settings, but in a fast-paced first-person shooter, you might want to upscale and possibly may or may not want to turn on frame generation, although this game does have FSR 3 frame generation as well as DLSS 3 frame generation, so both options are available here. If we look at relative performance without the frame generation factored in, we are seeing the 4070 hit 88 and the 7800 XT hit 100, giving a 14% lead to the 7800 XT. So it dropped down a bit from at the native resolution. Probably the 4070 scaling a little bit better when the resolutions are lower, probably due to its memory bandwidth not being as high. 1% lows are still a 29% lead for the 7800 XT though, although image quality wise on the upscaling, and I'd even say the frame generation, I would give the advantage to DLSS here. What if we move up to 4K resolution? Well, I hope you're not planning on playing at 4K Ultra with no upscaling in big Unreal Engine 5 games, because it's gonna be rough. We're seeing 29 FPS on the 4070 and 35 FPS on the 7800 XT. Again, that is giving a 21% advantage to the 7800 XT in the averages, and the 1% lows are even more dramatic, 27% advantage for the 7800 XT at 28 versus 22. But it's 28 and it's 22. So even though we have a win here with the 7800 XT, I don't think these settings are particularly relevant, since it's just not the way that anybody, I think, would choose to actually play the game. So what if we kick on some extreme levels of upscaling? We're going on to performance mode, so at 1080p resolution internally, then upscaled to a 4K output. Here versus DLSS 3 versus FSR 3 upscaling. Again, I'd give image quality advantage for the same types of fine details and disoccluded objects and things like that, advantage to DLSS. It's just a little less sparkly too. Anyway, 78 FPS versus 70 here though, so performance-wise we do get advantage 11% for the 7800 XT, but again, image quality-wise, advantage 4070. And then again, both these are hitting high enough base frame rates where I think kicking on frame generation could make sense. But again, look at frame generation focused videos for a much more in-depth discussion of what I think about that. Let's take a look at one more Unreal Engine 5 game. We're looking at a lot of Unreal Engine 5 here, but I did test out several more games I'm not going to include in this video. If you want to look at my Unreal Engine 5 focused video, go search that up on the channel. Anyway, RoboCop Rogue City, we've got 1080p Ultra, 97 FPS versus 89. They're both doing well, although 9% lead for the 7800 XT in both the averages and in the 1% lows. But as I was saying, Unreal Engine 5 performance is kind of a big deal, since this is going to be a engine used by tons of new games. I think a lot of game developers are looking for moving increasingly to this third-party solution rather than develop their own engine internally. At 1440p Ultra, both GPUs are good for over 60 FPS, although it is still 7% advantage for the 7800 XT at 65 versus 61, and the 1% lows are 55 versus 52, so 6% average in the 1% lows advantage to the 7800 XT. Both are performing pretty well here. However, in a first-person shooter, you might be seeking for a bit more performance. And again, one good option to get that, especially in Unreal Engine 5, can be upscaling, but you can also turn down graphics settings, which is what we'll look at first here. At 1440p high settings, we're seeing both GPUs close to 70 FPS, although the 4070 did now pull ahead. We're at 70 FPS for the 4070 and 68 on the 7800 XT. That gives a 3% lead to the 4070, but again, if you're 5% or lower difference, like, good luck telling the difference if you didn't have a frame rate counter. So I really would call this more of a tie. 5% lead for the 4070 and the 1% lows at 60 versus 57. But again, what we'll see is that if you enable upscaling instead of just turning down to high settings, you actually get a much more dramatic performance boost, and this seems to be a pattern in Unreal Engine 5. Sticking to the Ultra settings, but kicking on quality level upscaling, frame rate numbers jump all the way to 89 and 97 respectively. So 9% lead in the averages to the 7800 XT, and that's even before you factor in frame generation, that's without factoring in frame generation. However, if you look at the FSR image quality here, I really don't like how sparkly and unstable it looks. This is one of the worst FSR upscaling implementations I've seen. Now, you could use Unreal Engine 5's built-in TSR upscaling as I think actually a better option for AMD GPUs in this game. Anyway, what about 4K resolution? Well, if we look at 4K high settings, because the Ultra settings I think we're a bit much. At high settings, we're at 37 versus 34 FPS, advantage 4070. And in the 1% lows, we're seeing 33 versus 31, again, advantage for the 4070, giving it a 9% advantage in the averages and a 7% advantage in the 1% lows. But if we did want to try out the Ultra settings, we could use some pretty aggressive upscaling. If we go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, we see frame rate numbers jump to 68 and 74 respectively. So performance-wise, very usable on both, and that's even without factoring in frame generation. But again, image quality-wise, really not a fan of the FSR upscaling in this game in particular. So where usually I would give, advantage DLSS up, image quality-wise, in this game I would give extreme advantage DLSS. All of the little details look pretty pixelated here. So what do I think about these GPUs? Well, officially at MSRP of $550 versus $500, the 4070 is supposed to be 10% more expensive. However, if we look at the current market, 4070s are sometimes available slightly below that at $535, although the vast majority, $550 is a pretty realistic price. The 7800 XT, has been usually selling above its $500 MSRP at $510, $520, somewhere around there. So if you adjusted this to more like $550 versus $510, it's more like an 8% price gap. If you allow the 4070 to sometimes be discounted a bit, it's even closer in price. So really, these GPUs are very, very similar in price. So which one would I recommend? Well, honestly, I think that they're both a good purchase. I would also hope that perhaps we'll see some downward pricing pressure on both of them as the 4070 Super releases in just a couple of days as of my time of filming this video. Now, granted, that's a $600 MSRP, but, maybe it could push some downward pressure on this $500 price point, which would be nice. So maybe wait a little bit for the end of January to at least expire if you're watching this video near its release time, and see if there's any price movement on these. But anyway, what do I actually think about these? Which GPU would you rather have? Let's say they do cost the same. Well, honestly, it's gonna depend a bit on some personal preferences because I really do think both of them make a lot of sense. There's the most obvious hardware advantages, one way or the other, is that the 7800 XT is a 16 gigabyte VRAM GPU versus the 12 gigabytes on the 4070. And the most obvious hardware advantage for the 4070 is that it is more energy efficient. It's drawing less power. Now, the thing is, though, that what does that mean when you're actually just playing the games? Currently, we saw very few, if any, instances where 12 gigabytes of VRAM was a limiting factor. The most likely case was probably Resident Evil 4 at 4K resolution, which would explain why the AMD GPU had a performance advantage, even though we had ray tracing enabled and it was a noticeable performance advantage. That's and again, when we see a lot of VRAM allocation going on over here. But again, that's maxed out 4K settings. How realistic is that? So, really, I think if you're planning to use these GPUs at 1080p resolution, then it's, sorry, not 1080p resolution, 1440p resolution, which I think is the most common, target for GPUs of this price and class, then I don't think the 12 gigabytes of VRAM is that big of a deal right now. Now, if you hang on to your graphics card for 5 or 6 years, I do think it'll probably be the case more and more frequently that 12 gigabytes of VRAM isn't going to max your game out, but will you be wanting to max the game out anyway? I mean, the nice thing about big VRAM pools is you can keep maxed out textures and things like that. But in general, we can already see that at 1440p resolution, these GPUs aren't always even hitting 60 FPS, even without ray tracing enabled in some of the latest, most graphically demanding titles. And then kicking on even heavier settings goes beyond that. Again, like we saw Lords of the Fallen, for instance, at 1440p ultra settings, we're only averaging in the mid-40s, right? So, and then that brings us to a big, big elephant in the room, which is upscaling. Because Unreal Engine 5, which will be a very popular engine, in all of the games I've tested, they have responded extremely well performance-wise to upscaling, as do some games in other engines as well. But the massive performance boosts you're getting in Unreal Engine 5 titles from upscaling does make the fact that DLSS just does have an image quality advantage over FSR a pretty big deal in my opinion, especially given the fact that, again, if you're using these GPUs at 1440p, right now, you're already on that borderline of maybe you should be upscaling for performance reasons. And as we go on for the next year or two, that's just likely to be pushed even further. So that brings me to my personal preference. I think if I was gonna, for example, put together an optimized settings list for a lot of these latest graphically demanding single-player AAA games, it would include upscaling at the quality setting, especially if I had an Nvidia GPU where DLSS quality often looks very good at 1440p resolution. And because of that, I think in general, when your performance numbers are fairly close, the better image quality when you are using upscaling, if you are going to be using upscaling, becomes a bigger deal. So it's the upscaling quality that would push me towards the 4070 for my slight recommendation. That being said, you know, the other big difference is ray tracing performance. I'm less sold on that. I mean, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is a game that's using ray tracing at all times, and it does give the 4070 a lead, but it's not a mind-blowing lead. In games that are using ray tracing so heavily that it gives the 4070 a mind-blowing, you know, like it's in a totally different class of performance, like Alan Wake 2's path tracing mode, for example, where the 4070 is literally doubling the performance of the 7800 XT, it's still only achieving 34 frames per second itself, right? Which is like, is that going to be the way you would play this game? And I just really don't think, at least for me, that would be the way I would play the game. Now, granted, using upscaling can kind of get beyond that, but even upscaling at the quality setting at 1080p resolution, which I'd really rather not do, the 4070 is still falling short of a 60 FPS experience there. And, you know, given that the game still looks great at just 1080p high settings, which I had in here somewhere, where you can hit 74 FPS with no upscaling, you know, like I think that's, I don't know, guys. I'm not sure. Path tracing is really, the 4070's pretty borderline, and personally, I think I'd keep the path tracing modes off. For example, at 1440p resolution, I'm okay with quality level upscaling, as I already stated. But if we try to do RT Overdrive at the quality setting upscaling, the 4070, sure, it's 90% faster than the 7800 XT, but that still only puts it to 44 FPS, and I'm not going to be playing a first-person shooter at 44 FPS, even a single-player one. And if we have to push all the way down to performance mode upscaling, I just, to hit 60 FPS, well, I mean, honestly, guys, DLSS is a really good upscaler, but performance mode upscaling at 1440p doesn't look good enough to me. So if the whole point of the RT Overdrive was to increase visual fidelity, I think you're losing too much on the upscaling to make that worthwhile. So I'm not too hung up on the ray tracing performance differences here. For me, the upscaler is the much bigger deal, especially given the fact that in a lot of you know, current releases already at the end of 2023, these GPUs are not hitting 60 FPS maxed out at 1440p without upscaling. So anyway, if you're playing, you know, your personal preferences could differ from mine. So I'd go slight edge for the 4070 if these cost about the same. But if you're more likely to turn settings down rather than to enable upscaling, then perhaps your opinion would differ. And again, 16 gigabytes of VRAM will be a nice thing to have. You can see right here, games are already pushing right up to that 12 gigabyte borderline, and at times potentially already even spilling over it. So another thing to consider when you're maxed out at native resolution. I hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and huge thank you to channel members, channel subscribers, viewers. All of you are awesome. And again, check out that $10 discount I can get you at jawa.gg using code OWEN10 to save $10 off your first purchase. And check out the community on their Discord page as well. Everything, follow the link in the video description and or pinned comment. I hope all of you have an excellent day.